Talking to some friends that work on the lending side, I know the personal guarantees can sometimes be the toughest part for early stage brands because it's like, I don't want to have to put my house up just to get the funding that I need for my business. But I know for many lenders that mitigates the risk that the lenders feel they're taking on.
They want to know that you're going to help them in making sure that the collateral can be converted into the cash to pay them off and make them whole. So they don't want you saying, oh, I defaulted, good luck in collecting those receivables. I defaulted, good luck in finding the inventory. Hey, I'm out of here. Because they know that in most of these early stage growing businesses, they've got a better shot at collecting by foreclosing on the collateral than they have coming after you and going to court, knowing that you're probably all in on your business and there's nothing really left to get.
Finding the right funding opportunities for your beauty brand can feel overwhelming, especially when you want to keep your equity. Many early stage founders struggle with cash flow challenges, growing inventory needs, the rising costs of scaling. I totally get it. But there are other opportunities to fund growth without giving up on your business. And that's what we're going to talk about in this episode of the Scaling Emerging Beauty podcast. I sit down with Marshall Lebovits, a financial expert with 35 years of experience helping CPG and beauty brands grow smartly through asset-based funding. Marshall shares his advice on how asset-based funding works and why it's non-dilutive, when it makes sense for your brand to consider asset-based funding and when it doesn't, how to prepare your financials to actually qualify for funding. And this goes across the board, whether it's asset-based funding, private equity, etc. And then we'll also talk a little bit about some common mistakes that founders might make and how to avoid them. If you are serious about scaling your brand, I think this episode is worth a listen. It's one of those things that might not necessarily always be the right fit right now, but it's never too late to inform yourself and to understand what those options are. This episode is jam-packed with gems. I certainly learned a lot, and so I'm grateful to Marshall for sitting down with me. Let's go ahead and get into the episode. As of the published date of this episode, I am an associate of Ulta Beauty. The ideas and thoughts represented here are my own and not that of my employer. Marshall, when you reached out to me and kind of shared what you did, I saw so much value in what you offer brands, because we know the non-dilutive part is super critical, especially for early stage brands. And this is agnostic if you're a beauty brand, if you're in CPG in general, having that non-dilutive funding is super critical. So just because I know many of the folks who listen, many of the folks in the audience aren't necessarily finance folks,
right?
Can we just start off by explaining what asset-based funding is and how that might differ from traditional loans or venture capital, since many folks are very familiar with those areas?
Absolutely. So asset-based funding is a type of a loan where the lender is focused on the collateral value of invoices and purchase orders, inventory, or equipment, rather than in a traditional loan, the focus is on the cash flow generated by the business. So the collateral value of all the assets I mentioned can impact the amount of funding, the interest rates, and the repayment terms. Asset-based funding can be revolving and it can be scalable and doesn't involve, and here's the key, it doesn't involve any transfer of the entrepreneur's shares. So it's non-dilutive, right? By comparison, venture capital involves an equity investment in a business in exchange for shares in the business. So it's dilutive funding. So here's another way to look at it. A lender simply wants to get repaid its principal plus interest. The venture capitalist puts their dollars completely at risk in support of you, the entrepreneur, getting rich. But they want to get rich with you.
I like that. That's really good. So, just for clarity for myself, with this asset based funding, are you specifically only funding things like inventory, or would you fund something like product development or marketing? Is it open in terms of what you specifically might be funding?
There are limits, right? Asset-based funding is focused on the collateral value that you have, right? So it's any growing business with less than perfect credit that has invoices, purchase orders, inventory, or equipment. All of those could be a great candidate for asset-based lending. So what do I mean by a company that has less than perfect credit? It's usually a company that's emerging growth, that lacks access to capital for reasons they are short time in business, they're hyper growth sales, they have customer concentrations, right? So they're selling a lot of their product only to one or two buyers. They have weak cash flow and highly leveraged balance sheets. So think of a beauty brand that has less than perfect credit selling their products through retailers like Sephora, Ulta, Sally Beauty, Target, Walmart. These are all brands that might be good candidates to use asset-based financing to solve working capital problems.
Okay, so talk to me a little bit about what some of the advantages might be of this asset-based funding, because it sounds like the collateral is more so the value that you have. So that could be your inventory, to your point, or some of the other assets, but you can use that as the leverage to borrow against. So what are some of these advantages that folks who use this type of lending?
So here's, I think, the most important one, which is you can use asset-based funding as both a revolving and scaling source of capital as you grow. And also it can be a better match to when you need funds and the repayment of that loan, more so than a revenue-based loan or a term loan. And then the other important thing is there's no dilution, right? That's why I love asset-based financing. No dilution. You're not giving up equity. Those are all the key reasons I think that this is a really strategic and beneficial source of funding for growing beauty brands.
And when you talk about this being a revolving door, Marshall, are you seeing some of the folks that you work with, brands, are they using this at a specific point in their growth cycle? Are they using it at multiple points? Is it more so like in the beginning when they're under 1 million? Is it when they're under 1 million and when they're, up to 10 million? How are you kind of seeing it being used in real life, if you will?
I've looked at all the deals I've evaluated and all the companies I've talked to over the last 8 years. Where I really find that asset-based financing becomes useful is really a company that has about $100,000 a month of B2B revenue. That's when I see it really start to make a difference in how they can fund their working capital challenges. And again, it's revolving and it can grow with you. So for those reasons, once you start using it, asset-based funding can take care of your working capital needs for many, many years. Now, you may change lenders, you may change solutions, but they're all still parts of asset-based funding, which can help you grow for a long, long time.
Thanks for clarifying. So with anything that has its advantages, there are also always risks or things to consider. So what are some of those risks or challenges that brands should be aware of when they are considering this type of funding?
Let me focus more on the challenges of how you get this type of funding, because we could be here for maybe a week or 2 weeks just talking about this question. But first and foremost, for asset-based funding, your financial reports must be accurate, especially the AR aging reports. And you've got to have a really good paper trail, which includes your purchase orders, shipping documents, and your invoices, because that's the primary collateral for many of the lenders. So if that paper trail's not right, then you're going to have a challenge in putting together an asset-based funding solution. So the other thing that is a challenge is that you can only get funding to the extent that you have collateral that the lender deems of value. So the lender's not going to provide you funding on receivables that you won't collect, right? So the creditworthiness of your debtors, the companies you're selling to, is extremely important, as are things like trade spend, dilution, chargebacks, returns, and slotting fees. So all of those things will impact how much money you can raise. And it's honestly one of the challenges that, from a big picture perspective, I see, which is often the borrower doesn't understand what they're using this capital for. And one of the first things they tell me is it doesn't solve a big enough problem. And it doesn't solve a big enough problem because really they're trying to solve the wrong problem with asset-based funding. But it does solve a working capital problem. So here's another challenge that I think a brand ought to focus on. And it goes hand in hand with the dilution issue, which is a lender's going to ask to see your retail sales agreements. And they're going to be looking for language in those agreements which creates a guaranteed sale or any sort of consignment transaction. So if that retailer can send back any or all of the items without any type of reason, you know what, it didn't sell, we're going to send it back. That's a guaranteed sale, and that makes it really hard to fund the working capital that you're trying to solve. And that's a really big issue, right? I see it all the time because they sign the agreements and then all of a sudden it's like, hey, what's this language right here? That says
that's pretty standard in retail, though. So I can imagine that that's tough. I mean, for many retailers will buy the inventory from the brand, but the retailers say if it doesn't sell, we'll either, send it back to you. We'll mark after we mark it down. Maybe there's some sort of damage in field or damage at the stores that they do. Or in some cases, you can do a return to vendor, an RTV.
Right.
But, then I'm not sure if you would count that as sellable, to your point with this asset-based funding. How do you look at the DTC business in terms of that being...
I was just about to go there. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So for a brand that has a significant portion of e-commerce and direct-to-consumer business, it can be harder and more expensive to get a loan because now you've only got inventory, right? And if you're not profitable, the lender looks at it and says, gosh, if you couldn't sell the product at a profit, how am I going to liquidate it in the event of a default and recover the loan balance? So it becomes more challenging to do funding tied to inventory for early stage DTC and e-commerce companies until you're really, really close to profitable or actually profitable. And that goes along with that, you have to have really good inventory accounting systems, right? So if you're not reconciling your inventory counts and you're not using a good portal online that always gives real-time information, then it becomes challenging. Now, you'll see some revenue-based lenders that will fund inventory based on the cash that's been running through your accounts for the last 90 to 180 days. It's a different type of loan. It's very expensive. And honestly, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit later as well. What I don't like about those kinds of loans is there's a mismatch between when you collect money from the sale of that item to when you actually have to put out the funds in order to build the inventory. Those loans require often that you repay them starting a week after you get the money. And you may be building inventory that you're not going to see repayment on or the cash for 90, 120, 150 days. And to me, that's a big problem in funding inventory for D2C type companies. Yeah.
Yeah, that's such an important point. I've had Abby June Richards, as I shared with you in our intro before we were recording the show, but she came on and talked a little bit about that cash conversion cycle, which is such a critical part of profitability and just maintaining your business, keeping it afloat when you are an early stage brand. And so that's a really important question to ask or something to consider when you are looking at funding is what is the payment cycle? When do I need to pay this back? Because everything that glitters ain't gold. And in some cases, it's not necessarily the interest rate, but it's almost the term and when you're expected to pay things back. That might be the kicker that doesn't make it make sense for you.
Absolutely.
So you talked a little bit about the types of assets that can be leveraged for funding. You talked a little bit about inventory or anything that you said can essentially be of value. So can you talk a little bit more about what some of those factors are when you're looking at, is this a brand that would be eligible for this asset-based financing? You talked a little bit about the DTC side, but just curious if there's anything else that's important when you're looking at that. What are some of those factors that lenders are looking for as well?
Let me address both of those for you, right? So, because what I do is arrange funding tied to specific assets, like a purchase order where you can fund up to 100% of cost of goods sold, but it's got to be tied to a firm, non-cancelable purchase order from a creditworthy buyer, right? And it's got to match up the purchase order volumes with the MOQs, which often can be difficult because you may have a situation where your manufacturer says, I need you to order 100,000 of these, but your purchase orders only add up to 80,000 units, not 100,000. So that makes it really challenging to fund that particular purchase order. With respect to invoices, you can finance up to 85% of the estimated net collectible amount. So in other words, if you bill $1, but because of slotting fees, trade spend, chargebacks, all those other fun things, you're only collecting 80 cents on the dollar, then you're going to be able to borrow up to 85% of the 80 cents. Right? So they're not going to lend you any more money than you can actually collect, leaving a little bit of cushion to make sure that there's money there to pay their interest and fees. And with inventory financing, you can fund up to around 50% of the lower of cost or fair market value. Right. So they're going to be more conservative on inventory because it's harder to collect in the event of a default situation. You know, they're going to have to go grab the inventory if they can find it, hope that it's in good condition, and hope that it's in a quantity enough where they actually have a way to dispose of it. Right. So let's go on to what are the key factors the lenders are looking for. They're going to look at a wide variety of criteria for determining whether or not they can make a loan. They are going to look at historical cash flow and understanding that most of the companies don't have historical cash flow. They have revenue, but they don't have profits and cash flow. So what do they look at next? Quality of the collateral, which we've talked about, you know, the receivables, how much cash are you collecting on those, the inventory, the purchase orders. Then they're going to look at the existing debt, you know, the leverage of your business and the strength of your balance sheet, including whether or not there's a personal guarantee that can be provided by the borrower, right? So expect for early stage companies, especially one where the key shareholder is also involved in day-to-day operations, expect that they're going to ask you for a personal guarantee. Now, for inventory-based loans, they're also going to want to know how much of your inventory is finished goods versus work in process or packaging or raw materials, as well as the details about the locations and where it may be stored. So that kind of gives you an idea of, you know, the things that they're looking at and making a decision.
Yeah, that's good. I know in talking to some friends too that work on the lending side, I know the personal guarantees can sometimes be the toughest part for early stage brands because it's like, I don't want to have to put my house up just to get the funding that I need for my business. But I know for many lenders that mitigates the risk that the lenders feel they're taking on by lending money to an early stage brand. But I very much empathize with founders in that way because like, I can only imagine what that must feel like. I mean, you have to be really bullish, right? To be like, oh, no problem.
So let me comment on that.
Yeah.
And why a lender asks for a personal guarantee, particularly in an asset-based funding situation where you've already got the collateral and that's your primary source of repayment. It's like, lend me against my receivables. If I default, go collect the receivables and you'll get whole on your loan. The personal guarantee from my perspective as an advisor and having been a lender in small business situations, growing business situations, is the lender wants to make sure that if you drive the car into the ditch, you don't just give them the keys and walk away. They want to know that you're going to help them in making sure that the collateral can be converted into the cash to pay them off and make them whole. So they don't want you saying, oh, I defaulted. Good luck in collecting those receivables. I defaulted. Good luck in finding the inventory. Hey, I'm out of here. Right? That's what they're trying to do, is they want you emotionally invested because, and I'm not giving legal advice here, and I won't tell you that this is the position that every lender takes, is that they know that they've got a better shot in most of these early stage growing businesses. They've got a better shot at collecting by foreclosing on the collateral than they have coming after you and going to court, knowing that you're probably all in on your business and there's nothing really left to get, right? So they want to make sure that you are laser focused at all times in helping them get whole by disposing of the collateral.
Wow, I've never had it explained like that, but let me tell you, it just reinforces how much money you kind of need to have to create a business or have your business, or the level of risk that you're okay with taking on if you are an entrepreneur. Not for the faint of heart. I always think about it myself, and I'm like, I don't know that I could stomach it. I don't think I could.
A lot of companies that I talk to have wonderful ideas, and they think that having a great idea alone is what's going to take them to the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. It takes a lot of money. And you may have an awesome idea and all your friends may love it, and you may have a big following on social media and you are selling the hell out of that product. But at the end of the day, if you can't sell it and make money, then that's a different issue. And that's where an equity investor should come in play and not necessarily a lender.
Thank you for sharing that. So look, we talked a little bit about the risk. Let's get back to, some good stories. If you could provide us with an example of a brand that you've worked with that successfully used asset-based funding to scale. If you could just tell us a little bit about how that loan helped them, maybe the stage or the position that they were in. I would just love to hear that story so that other founders that are listening might be able to say, okay, not yet, or okay, maybe this is something for me to consider.
So, it's like the TV commercials, use this product, but your results may differ. But two of my clients have ended up taking the financing that I arranged for them, and they catapulted onto the Inc. 5000 fastest growing private companies list. So I've had two clients. I can't tell you that specifically my money was solely the fuel that did that, because they raised equity as well, but it enabled them to stretch their equity and to achieve great heights. So in one case, I arranged an asset-based line of credit. It was backed by receivables and inventory for a consumer packaged goods brand, and it helped them grow revenues from about 15 million to over 45 million in less than 4 years. I know, that's pretty remarkable. So the revolving line tripled in size. So it scaled as they grew and enabled them to raise much less equity, which is really important to shareholders counting on an exit, right? Because they want to, the higher their return is, the less equity, right? So I then came back last year, actually, for the same company, and I arranged a multi-million-dollar sale leaseback of all their manufacturing equipment. Again, putting money into the coffers of the business without having to raise more equity and dilute the existing shareholders. So to me, that's a great story, right? Everybody is happy. The company is able to achieve its growth goals. It has flexibility. It uses it for working capital. In case of the equipment financing, it really provided cash that the investors didn't have to invest into the company.
That's a really good story. And congrats to them for being able to do that. I can totally see how leveraging that can help them again stretch that equity so that they can get more out of it and likely just reinvest that into their business for growth. Can you talk a little bit about the process that brands go through to prepare themselves for asset-based funding? You talked about having everything in order in terms of it sounded almost like bookkeeping, but what are the things that are critical so that when the brands approach the lenders, they have everything ready to go? And I say this so that the brands listening can say, okay, we're not ready yet, or we aren't there, but these are the things we want to put in place now so that we know we can be ready when the time comes.
To obtain the best funding solution for your company, it is very important to have correct information and financial reports. I provide my clients with a list of all the basic due diligence information that's going to be requested by the lender. And I always ask to see it in advance of sharing it with the lender, because inevitably I find, the number's wrong here, or something didn't get cleared out of the account, and so it doesn't look right on the report. So, having high quality, accurate, timely reports is one of the most important things you can do to be prepared for a lender. And like I said, the list is available. There's no secrets. This is what they're looking for in asset-based funding. I think there's two other things, and we kind of hinted or talked about them earlier, which is you have to know your trade spend numbers, right? If you're billing $1, the lender is going to ask you how much you're actually collecting. There's no reason you're not ready for that question. And the third item that is really important, and we've talked about that earlier, is you have to know your order to cash cycle. How long is it taking you from the time you get an order to turn it into cash, right? And if you don't get that order, because what we know the process for a lot of retailers is you get a forecast. I'm going to need X number of units to fill the pipeline on day one, and then I'm going to need replenishment. And I'm only going to...
But sometimes retailers adjust those forecasts so they're not always 100%.
Or they tell you that you need to have all of these units in the warehouse based on that forecast, and they may not give you a firm purchase order until 10 days, 2 weeks before they actually need it in their distribution center.
Right. So you need to produce to 10,000, let's say, but after the sales are actually in the system, they might say, actually, we think that we'll be fine with 7,000 units, which if you think about it, it's smart to the extent that, hey, you want to make sure you forecast for selling out the water, knocking it out the ballpark. But at the same time, on the brand side, it's like, okay, I got to get rid of these extra 3,000 units.
Especially you're an early stage company. And as I always say, receivables and inventory in the warehouse are cash that you can't use to grow your business. And so you're tying up all that cash. And how long are you going to have to tie it up for? For companies that may not be well capitalized, these are critical issues that can impact your viability and, I hate to say it, your longevity. How long are you going to stay in business if all your money's in receivables and inventory and none of it's being collected? So that the order to cash cycle is very, very important for any brand, whether it's approaching an asset-based lender, a revenue-based lender, or a more traditional bank.
Yeah, like an SBA or something like that. So how can founders or brand owners ensure they're getting the best terms and structure for their business when they're looking at asset-based funding? Are there standards? Is this kind of one of those things that has a governing body? Like, just give me some insight into how you can know this is a good deal or this isn't necessarily a good deal. If there's a Reddit board, share all the details, if you will, Marshall.
So while I can tell you where market terms are, what the best terms are depends on what's important to you as an entrepreneur. Do you value having the lowest rate? Right? Based on APR. Is it more important to you that you say, look, I'm not going to be using the money that long, so I'll accept a higher interest rate? What I want to know is, are my out-of-pocket interest costs going to consume all of my gross profit, right? So I think that in some cases, the amount of interest that you're going to pay, the amount of fees might be in some situations more important than the interest rate. Another issue I look at is what's the repayment schedule, right? We chatted a little bit about this. Is like, well, I've got to start paying back this loan in a week and start making payments every week or every day, but I'm not going to see the cash for 60 days. How do you work through that situation? Another question is, again, the personal guarantee, right? That's really important. I've got a client that right now we're trying to minimize the personal guarantee impact on the largest shareholder. And there are ways around that, again, depending on the circumstances. So it could be a really, really important issue in terms of getting the best deal for you. Here's another one that comes into play, and it's also coming into play on the same transaction, are financial covenants. Some lenders will say, I'll loan you this money and I'm going to give you better terms, but if you can't start generating positive cash flow sufficient to cover your interest charges, then I'm going to put you potentially into default and call the loan, right? So you may look at it and say, wait a minute, I'll take a higher rate rather than a covenant.
Marshall, who are you finding that founders are working with to help them evaluate these decisions? Is this like they're hiring a fractional CFO to help them to understand these decisions? Is the person that they're working with the lender? Like, are they helping them? I know that feels like that could be a little questionable, but like, who is helping them? Because everything that you're saying sounds really critical. And I'm thinking to myself, I kind of get numbers, but I don't know that I would be able to make all of the decisions that you're suggesting are important to make for this choice, this business choice.
So lenders work with their accountants, their fractional chief financial officers. They may have a board advisor or a board member who has a higher level of sophistication or understanding or experience with these kinds of issues. They may choose to work with an advisor such as myself, who this is all I do all day long, is help companies find appropriate asset-based solutions to meet their working capital needs. And for me specifically, I always put together a side-by-side analysis. If I'm bringing multiple deals to the table, or I'll even, if the borrower says, I've got another deal, I don't need you to run an auction, I just need you to help me understand how the deals compare, I'll put together a side-by-side analysis for them that highlights the key factors, the key structural items of each transaction, and so that we can see where the deals are similar and where they're different and how those differences matter most to your specific business.
That's really helpful. And it's good to know that that advisor piece is there because, again, I feel like there are so many pieces to running a business when you are an early stage founder, and there's just no way that you can know everything. So it is good to know that there are folks like you and many of the other consultants that are subject matter experts that can really help the brands with that.
Exactly. And relative to your point about, well, maybe the lender will help you. I've been a lender. I would say they can give you certain basic information.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, they are trying to rightfully make a sale. So whether or not you get full candor in helping you understand the difference between their proposal and somebody else's, I would say it's best to have somebody else by your side, a third party, whether, again, not necessarily me, but the fractional CFO, the board member, somebody who does this, and not necessarily your industry friends who may think that, I mean, they're well-meaning and they're your friends, but if this isn't what they do for a living, they may not understand why what worked for them may not work for you.
That's really, really good. Oh man, this is so helpful because I talk to so many brand founders again, and investment is becoming such a challenge these days, or looking for specifically angel investors and even VC funding. It's getting a lot tighter. And so I'm thinking that brand founders are going to have to educate themselves more on the different types of fundings available or the options available so that they can evaluate what works for them. I'd love for us to just wrap if you can. I like to ask all of my guests if you have any final advice for early stage entrepreneurs that are looking to explore asset-based funding as a growth strategy, if you have advice for them, or also share if you have general advice that you'd have for a CPG brand. Feel free to share either or both.
Look, at the end of the day, it is about making yourself aware of what's really most important to how to capitalize a business. And, we talked about it, using equity wisely, making sure that you know if you want to borrow money, why you're using it for, what hole it's plugging in your need for capital. Because if you don't know why and which problem you're trying to solve, you may end up with a solution that somebody sells you which may not really be best for what you're trying to accomplish, right? So it really is matching up needs and wants in an appropriate way and being prepared. I get it. Raising money's not fun. It's hard work. And generally, it's not as much fun as, hey, I'm going to run another campaign on social media, or I'm going to work on new branding. I'm going to work on new packaging. That's a lot more fun. I'm going to go sell to Ulta. It's a lot more fun than, oh man, I got to go raise some more money. It's like, let me just make a decision and get it over with and hope for the best and, get down on my knees and pray. And that's not necessarily the best path forward.
That's really wise, just because sometimes the things that we're not always good at, it might not be best to just say, we're going to wrap this up quickly, but that's where it is good to hire an advisor or look to someone who is a subject matter expert who can share with you what they would advise specifically for your business. Because I think the other thing that you shared was, even if you talk to another founder friend, their business is in a different growth cycle, a different scenario than your business. And so it's not always apples to apples. So I think if anything, it's like, take that for what it's worth and understand you need to still evaluate what makes sense for your business and then move forward from there.
So I'll do a shameless plug, which I wasn't really planning to do, but I'll do it anyway because I've got a really good example. I'm a success fee only advisor. I don't charge any money to talk, to give advice. And I have one client that was in the CPG space, a very early stage small company. And I gave them advice for 5 years. Didn't result in any funding, but my objective was to educate them and to make sure that along their journey, they didn't step into any potholes which would break both their ankles and keep them from completing the journey. Right? I really do care about my clients. We actually finally closed a financing about 60 days ago, a small working capital line of credit. And I'm thrilled for them because it's helping them with a nationwide launch into Target. So it helps them. It's now they've got a product that really fits their needs. And over the last 5 years, it's like, pick up the phone, call me. Let's talk about what you're looking at. I'll tell you the pros, the cons, and then you can make an informed decision. And if there's nothing in it for me, that's fine. You made a good decision that hopefully will keep you around long enough where one day we can do business. But it's not a requirement that, I make money off of everybody I talk to. I do a lot of mentoring, a lot of free advisory work just because I like helping entrepreneurs.
That's good. Well, I love to hear it because I definitely love helping entrepreneurs too. And I'm hopeful that for the folks that are listening, if this is something they want to explore more, go ahead and share where folks can find you, Marshall. And I'll make sure that we also include that in the show notes.
Yeah, I would say go find me on LinkedIn or reach out to me. I have a memorable email, so I've been told, which is marshall@funding911.com.
I love it. I love it. That's good marketing, Marshall. So you nailed that part. I know the finance folks aren't always thinking about that.
Yes.
Well, look, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate all of your knowledge and insights. I certainly learned some new things, and I'm hopeful that it helped some of our listeners today. So thank you.
Thank you, Monique.
That wraps up today's episode of Scaling Emerging Beauty. A big thank you to Marshall for breaking down the world of asset-based funding. As I shared in the intro, I definitely learned some things and think this is a viable option for some early stage brands to consider. I know that this might not be right for everyone, but it could be right for you. And so if you want to learn more, you can feel free to reach out to Marshall. I'm leaving his information in the show notes below. And you can also connect with him on LinkedIn, and he'd be more than happy to help you out. It's important for founders to know how to ask the right questions, how to evaluate if lenders are the right options or the right partners for them, and to do so in a smart way. If you're still listening to this show, thank you so much for being here. I know that you are busy and have plenty of other things to do, so I do appreciate you listening. If you haven't, please consider leaving a review on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts. If you're watching me on YouTube, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss an upload. And if you're listening on Apple or Spotify podcasts, make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss an episode. As always, thank you for listening, and I'll catch you on the next episode. Bye.